Thank you. I would like to say that I'm really grateful for being here, so thank you very much. I'm a Norwegian, so there could be some typos here, so I have to apologize for that. So I'm going to talk about verbalized shame. And this means that language is really important. So it's verbalized shame and not non-verbalized. I will start off with a small play. First, I will be a client, and I will also be the therapist. And I'm having this in the background because as a therapist, I can be a bit uncertain about what the client is really meaning with the emotion words that he is using. So I'll start off reading the line. I feel shame. Shame. Yes. I feel shame. 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 Luckily, I have a definition. That's it. Highly unpleasant, self-conscious, dishonorable, immodest. Shame may motivate not only avoiding behavior, but also defensive, retaliative anger. And having a really highly unpleasant, self-focused emotion. Maybe even also feeling of angry. Oh, where do you have this from? That's the definition for the word. Oh, no, it's not. I'm not feeling that. Yes. So with this small play, I think you can understand that a dictionary approach to shame is not a good approach to shame. Still, people go to a dictionary to find out what shame is. Even researchers do it, therapists do it, students do it all the time. But the question is, why do they go to a dictionary when I, with this simple play, illustrated that that's a really bad approach if you want to understand what shame is? It's because there is no agreement on what shame is. And we don't even fully understand what an emotion is. So when we have issues with understanding emotions or an emotion in general, can you imagine the challenges we have when we try to specify emotions? So it's no wonder that people turn to dictionaries because we don't really know. But we do know something. We know a dictionary definition cannot be trusted. And that's a really good start. A dictionary definition is excellent for physical objects that are constant in size, that do not change their qualities, whether they are being looked at or not. A stone is a stone. But a dictionary definition is terrible for understanding human language. So this therapist that we had here now used a definition because the therapist assumed that the word like shame will carry with it a universal, stable meaning. And this is one of the biggest challenges in shame research. And the reason for it to be a challenge is that it completely ignores subjectivity and basic understanding of semantics. And that's ironic when people work with shame, that they ignore these two aspects. Now we know that the key aspect of subjectivity is, of course, how a person constructs herself or construe her experience in all of the social relations that are available to a person. So subjectivity is a constant construction. It's a construction process, which is affected by the situation in which the person finds herself. So according to Foucault, a social world will form us. And education will form us. And upbringing will form us and will then influence how we understand different concepts. This means that the subjective understanding of I feel ashamed can coexist with other subjective understandings. And a dictionary ignores this. So if someone say, I feel ashamed, millions of other understandings can exist of the same expression because it's a consequence of subjectivity. So a dictionary do not accept subjectivity. Another aspect of trying to approach shame is to understand the basics of semantics. According to Donald Davidson, a philosopher on semantics, a word like ashamed has no specific meaning. It's just a component. It has to have other components around it before meaning can be created. So the word needs to be placed in a sentence. And this is a core element of talking. Keywords are placed in a sentence, and the sentence, the components around the keyword, will provide meaning to the word. So shame has to be placed in a meaning-giving sentence. So this is a sentence. I feel ashamed. What we now know is that shame is about the person saying it. And it's something that I feel. But more than this, we don't know. We don't know what shame means for this person. We know it's about her, and she has an emotional experience, but that's all we know. So what is missing here is the reason for the shame being felt. Now, the reason will give us information about what shame means for this person. So we can ask them, what do you mean when you say that you feel ashamed? So they might answer this, because I lied to you last night. Now, shame has been provided with meaning through a sentence. And this is something that is largely ignored in quantitative research on shame, this simple aspect. And I will show you a consequence of ignoring this, not with shame, with the word shame, but with other related words. I will show you a study where we provide keywords in context, that is in a sentence, and keywords detached from a sentence, isolated. And we will see what what will happen with the responses, the mean levels that participants respond with, and what happens with standard deviation. So standard deviation can be understood as not being quite sure about what is meant. That's an okay way to look at standard deviation. So the higher the standard deviation is, the more uncertain people are in understanding the word that they are being presented with. So we use a response scale from 1 to 7, and then we measure 4 emotion words. And we measure them in a way that is quite typical for shame research, detached from a sentence, and we measure them within a meaning-giving sentence. That is also typical for shame research. So it would look like this. So the word small would be in the first sentence. I feel small when thinking about the Tatars. That's the name of the minority that has been abused. I feel small when thinking about the Tatars and the abuse they have experienced. So the term small is now in a sentence. And then we contrast this with just having, at this moment, thinking about the mistreaters of Tatars. How much do you feel of the following? Thereby also small. Now, the last one is a difficult cognitive process, because the reader has to transport the word up to the sentence and transport the sentence back to the word to understand where the word small relates or where it belongs. That's a much more heavy cognitive process than to see it in a sentence. So the result of these two approaches look like this. This is the mean levels. So when the word small, for instance, is placed within a meaning-giving sentence, the mean level is significantly higher than if it's presented in isolation. Meaning that it's still more difficult to find significant differences between emotions if you detach words from its meaning. So the mean levels go up when you have it in a sentence. If you don't have it in a sentence, they go down. But what happens with the standard deviation that can be understood as not being quite sure about what is meant, when you look at this compared to the mean, the standard deviations are much higher, significantly higher when they are presented in isolation than when presented in a sentence. Now, this goes back to the importance of not ignoring that key words like shame or other words belong in a sentence and not in a dictionary. Because if it's detached, then words are less agreed upon. No, they are, yeah. So single words carry with it less meaning unless it's placed in a meaning-giving sentence. So this supports a sentence-based design. So I just wanted to say this before I go into shame, because I understand we are talking about how you can actually try to understand shame and analyze shame. So the take-home message is, don't use dictionaries. So people are subjective, and they place words in sentences. Don't ignore this. So if shame language is subjective and words carry with it little meaning, how can we find out about what shame is? Well, there are a lot of inconsistencies in the shame literature. There's a lot of paradoxes, confusions. It's about various understanding of what shame is, what it does. But there are key agreements, some really important key agreements that can help us design studies, questionnaires, and analyze them. Especially in quantitative research, if you use structural equation modeling, a really nice approach to investigating relational networks of emotion experiences. So one of the key elements that all shame research agree upon is that shame is about an activated self. We have known this for 100 years. The self has to be activated in order to feel shame. Some aspect of the self, whether this is intrapersonal or if it's social identity based, some aspect of the self must be activated for shame to be felt. This is why some authors go as far as saying that shame is about the self. So shame cannot be experienced if the self is not activated. So the self must be implicated. This goes whether it's intrapersonal, interpersonal, or on group level. So said very easily, there can be no shame if there is no self. This is why it's a struggle to talk about emotions when the self has been dismantled, or if the self has been lost. There's a challenge to have emotional experiences because the self cannot be activated if it doesn't exist. So to some extent, there must be a self. This is why shame is called a self-focused emotion. So the agreed network of the shame experience, activation of the self. The second aspect that shame literature agrees upon is that there must be a violation of a moral norm. But it must be an internalized moral norm. Violation of an internalized, and you can see that I've underlined this, and this is because the norm must be an integrated part of the self, for the self to appraise that it has violated something. Said in another way, if people are unaware of the moral norm, you cannot expect that they should feel shame for it. Because the moral norm has not been internalized. Why? They don't even know about the moral norm. So if you work with norm violators, and they don't even know about the norm that they have been violated, they cannot feel shame for it. So people would typically say, oh, it's a shameless person. Probably not. It's a moral norm-less person. So you cannot expect anyone to feel shame if they are unaware of the norm that they have violated. Or they are aware of it, but they disagree with it. So they have not internalized it. They are aware, but they have not internalized it. They cannot be expected to feel shame. So this means that when we design studies on shame or investigate shame, we have to investigate aspects of a human experience focusing on a norm that has been internalized. So the norm has to be an internalized norm. This is why shame is called a moral emotion. It's because it's about morality. So it's called a self-focused emotion in the literature because it's about the self, and it's called a moral emotion because it's about morality. So if you look at the literature on shame, you can see, and you synthesize it, you can see that the self has been activated because of an internalized moral norm failure. So something has happened, a norm has been violated, and then because of the violation of the norm, the self is activated. But the literature also agree on unpleasantness and unpleasant criticism. There is a high level of consensus that if someone decides to use the word shame for their emotional experience, they also use it to verbalize an unpleasant emotional experience. So experience of unpleasantness in shame is typically illustrated by two forms of criticism. Either it's self-criticism, people are criticizing their self that has been activated by the norm-violating failure, or social criticism, criticism from others because of the norm violation. So when you read the shame literature, you can find these two forms of criticism being talked about all the time. Someone focused more on self, others focus more on social aspects. So if you look at self-criticism first, it's typically because the self is not functioning the way it ought to function. So when people criticize themselves, they criticize the functionality of their self to live up to moral standards. You can, of course, feel shame for many other reasons than morality, competence, for instance. But people typically force it into a "I shouldn't have done it that way" kind of explanation, leading it into right or wrong, leading it into morality. So typically, self-criticism, I'm not functioning the way I should. You can increase this to another level, social identity level. We are not functioning the way we should function. There must be something defective with us. So it's an internal judgment criticizing the self and the integrity of the self. So when you look at shame, shame can therefore involve milder forms of self-criticism, harder forms of self-directed anger, self-directed hostility, disgust, or criticism so severe that people cannot bear it anymore and they kill themselves. This is why shame is called a self-critical emotion. It's because the shame experience criticizes the self. So you have internalized moral norm failure, activating the self, and then the self starts with criticism directed at the self. But you can also find literature focusing on social criticism. And that is the concern that others might find out about the failure, the way it's not ought to be. And they will condemn you for it. And they will criticize you for it. And the psychological understanding of the process is that the failure is already exposed or is about to be exposed. Or at least I believe there is a risk for this to be exposed. And if it is exposed, if it will be exposed, I will be socially criticized. My family will lose respect. My village will be dishonored. I will be disliked. And this will, of course, hinder the fulfillment of my need for belongingness with others. So the failure that has activated the self can receive public condemnation or social condemnation or condemnation from your spouse. So a social aspect of the criticism. And depending on how heavy or serious the norm violation is, you can meet it with anger, violence, or even murder. Or in a societal way, you can imprison people for it. So this is the reason that shame is sometimes called a social emotion. It's because of the social criticism that can come with it. And this is, of course, why a therapist or a really good friend build trust before they talk about norm failures. So you can avoid the fear of condemnation. So we see that the internalized norm failure will activate the self. It will activate self-criticism, and the person also need to account for possible social criticism. They need to prepare for what is coming. And because of this, you will have actions or coping strategies or motivations or action tendencies, whatever they call it in the literature that you are reading. So shame is typically also seen as a motivator for action. You have to do something to cope with not the norm failure, not the activation of the self, but the criticism that will follow. Either you have to do something about the self-criticism that will come, or you have to do something about the feared social criticism that might come or that has already come. So there will be actions. And the literature is divided on this. Some focus mainly on shame promoting antisocial, maladaptive, self-defensive strategies. It typically came from around the late 1980s, early 1990s, coming from the social clinical field. And they defined shame as maladaptive. So you can see that in the literature originating around this decade. There's another camp, more contemporary camp, that acknowledge this literature and the findings, but also see that shame promotes strategies that go toward a pro-social, adaptive, self-reformatory approach or direction. People want to repair, apologize, try to be better, try to change as a person. So this tendency to observe this in shame studies started around late 2000, early 2010. So this is why shame is also called an action emotion. So I don't know the time. How am I doing on time? Yeah. Oh, okay, means 15. Oh wow, wonderful. So I will present at least one study, maybe two, but at least one, to illustrate how we can can research shame as an emotion network. So where the self is activated through moral norms that has been violated, and you can trace the shame experience through how people appraise the norm violation and the situation that they are in, and which emotion words that they use to describe the unpleasantness that they are feeling, and what actions or coping strategies that they start to think that they will use. So we can talk about it later if you want to, but this is the scale that we are using. It's built on qualitative research, the most typical expressions that people use when they are having a tough time emotionally due to norm failures. So we use this to tap into the shame experience. So what we did in the first study, we approached participants, and we made them come into rooms for around 5 to 7 participants at a time. 5 to 7 because that's the most conform group size. And they received no compensation, so freely participating. We told them this is a study on social emotions. Whatever happens in this room, you're not allowed to talk. If you want to withdraw, you can do that whenever you like. But if you decide to do so, please don't talk. And we can talk about it afterwards on the outside of the room. So cannot talk. And the reason we are using these two, the most conform group size and you cannot talk approach of the design, is that if you are conform, you're typically doing what everyone else is doing in the room. And if everyone has to be silent, then silence will be a motivator for thinking about unpleasant things. So we are using it for manipulation. So the participants are handed 2 envelopes. On the one envelope, it just has number 1 on it. And on the other envelope, it has a number 2 on it. In the first envelope, participants are being explained that you cannot open envelope number 2 until everyone has finished with the questionnaire that is in envelope number 1, put it back into the questionnaire, and handed it to the experimenter. When everyone has done this, you will be told that you can now open number 2. Now, in the first envelope, there is a short questionnaire about family identification. The reason for this is, of course, to see if they identify with their family, but also to start to warm up the brain thinking about family relations, because the study is about violating someone in a family. So after this, they are being told to write down a story about something bad that they did to one of their family members. So family identification and a personal story about something bad they did where they are not allowed to mention any names. When everyone has done this, and this is a challenge for some. For some participants, no problem. They write down a story, put it back into the envelope and hand it to the experimenter. Other participants have a bit of a struggle thinking that they ever did something bad to someone in their family. But due to the silence in the group, when people hand back their stories and envelopes, it's a social reinforcing environment that say, come on, are you writing something so we can go on with this? And this social pressure makes them write down stories. And the stories are like, I handed my child to a nanny knowing that she hit my child, but I had to go to work. Ranging from those kind of stories to I cheated on my husband, to I lied to my sister, whatever. So a big variety of moral failures. And then they were when they handed the first envelope, they were told, now you can open envelope number 2. And here we have the questionnaire, where we account for the self and moral failures and appraisal of the situation and feelings and strategies. But the manipulation is for the, so here comes the manipulation. Half of the group will have a cover page of the questionnaire that says, after you have finished with the questionnaire, a typical story of a moral failure will be read out loudly to the group. But when you think about what you just wrote down, how do you think and feel and want to do about this? And then the questionnaire comes. The other group has the same layout on the first page, but it says, after everyone has completed with the questionnaire, your story that you just handed to the experimenter will be read out loudly for the group. Now, how do you think and feel and want to do about this? And then the questionnaire comes. This is, of course, not true. This is deceiving the participants. So there's unpleasantness for about 15 minutes. Very thorough debriefing. Psychological support if something should come up. And every participant is insured. So all ethical consideration except lying to them have been taken. So what I want to show you now is that we have 2 groups. One that has no concern about their story coming out to the group. They are safe. They just have to reflect on their story. And then we have another group where their moral failure will be exposed or is about to be exposed. So if we go back to the literature now, we should have a self-criticism condition and a social criticism condition. So this is a structural equation model, and what it shows you is that all participants are located there. But we coded the participants where there's a risk for social image, where people can be condemned, coded them with plus, and the other participants with minus. So, but I will put you through it. All participants, regardless of the 2 conditions, think there must be something wrong. This is why it's not significant. So everyone thinks there must be something wrong. But it's only the participants where the story is going to be read out that are now concerned for a possible condemnation from others. It's only them. And I will show you what will happen. So, if you are in the condition where your story is about to be known, publicly exposed, the participants start to think this will invite social criticism. They start to feel rejected. They start to feel rejection words, or they start to report them. No rejection has happened, but their feelings are being in that direction. So they are expecting it. And if you work with your teens, you reject the teenagers, they know you will reject them. So they are already rejected. So I feel condemnation, I start to feel rejected, and then I go into self-defense. I want to avoid. I want to physically avoid the one that I hurt. I want to physically avoid other people that could know about story, including people in the room. And I would like to avoid thinking about it, psychologically avoiding it, minimizing the story, covering up lies, etc. So for the other participants that do not feel condemnation, something must be wrong with me. They start to report shame words, shame, humiliated. And the more they report this, without being concerned for exposure, the more they go into pro-social motivation. They have empathy with the one that they have hurt. They want to repair. They want to help. They want to fix it. They absolutely do not have a need for self-defense. So with this example, we can see that we can trace the shame experience as a relational pattern where we can start to predict what will happen if you account for how people appraise the situation that they are in. I can take some questions about this later. I have 1 minute left. So whatever we ended up with, don't use lexicon definitions. Shame is very complex. There's a lot of disagreements. I've seen some participants nodding. I've seen some participants going like this. There's a lot of disagreements, but there are agreements. And they are really important. 4 agreements must be accounted for if you want to understand and research shame. 1, moral norms. They must be internalized. 2, the self must exist. 3, there will be criticism and something will happen. So when researching shame, see it as an integrated, complex cognition emotion process where thoughts, feelings, and actions interact in a relational network that is expanding as the experience is ongoing. And it becomes more and more complex. So if they haven't fixed a previous failure, they have to carry this into next failure situation. And then this the shame experience will be more and more intense for the person. And the self will be appraised as more and more effective, leading up into unpleasant situations for the client. So, thank you.